morning sun filtered softly through the tall oaks lining our quiet suburban street, casting gentle shadows on the freshly mowed lawns. Birds chirped lazily in the distance, their songs mixing with the distant hum of a lawnmower. Everything looked serene, the kind of picture-perfect neighborhood that many would envy. But for my family, beneath the neat sidewalks and manicured gardens, a storm had been quietly brewing for months. My daughter Layla was 12. She had a bright smile that could light up any room, but the world had not been entirely gentle with her. Born with a slight disability that made her balance delicate and her legs weaker than other children's, she had grown resilient, careful, and remarkably cheerful. She loved the outdoors, and nothing brought her more joy than rolling through the cul-de-sac on her small wheelchair, waving at neighbors, and stopping to admire the flowers planted along each driveway. For a while, everything seemed normal. Layla would wave at the neighbors as she rolled past, and I would watch from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee, feeling a quiet gratitude for the calm life we had built here. But there was one person who never seemed to share the neighborhood's serene demeanor, Mrs. Karen Whitmore, our HOA president, and a woman whose reputation for cruelty had quietly spread through whispered complaints. Among residents, Karen was in her mid-50s, always immaculately dressed, her hair permed and stiff, her face often wearing an expression of perpetual disdain. She took her self-appointed role as the enforcer of rules far too seriously, and anyone who dared to step slightly outside her narrow definitions of order immediately felt her icy scrutiny. Her obsession with minor regulations, garden decor, fence heights, even the placement of welcome mats was legendary. But beneath the trivial complaints and obsessive emails, there was something darker, a sharp, unforgiving temper that she rarely hid. Over the past few months, Karen had taken a particular interest in Layla. At first, I brushed it off as overzealous policing. Karen had cornered me once about the angle of our mailbox, then about the flowers I planted near the curb. But soon, her attention shifted. I noticed her watching Layla more frequently during our morning walks. Her gaze was calculating, almost predatory, and she would often follow us from a distance, muttering under her breath. There were days when Layla would come home visibly upset, insisting that Karen had yelled at her for taking too long to cross the street, or for blocking the sidewalk with her wheelchair. I tried to warn Layla about Karen without frightening her, teaching her to stay calm and ignore the woman's harassment. Some people, I said gently, get upset when others are happy. Don't let her ruin your day. But even as I offered these reassurances, a knot of anxiety had begun to form in my stomach. Karen's behavior was escalating, and I had the growing sense that her next move could be dangerous. On that particular morning, everything seemed deceptively normal. Layla wheeled herself outside, her small backpack strapped snugly on her back, ready to make the short trip to her friend's house across the street. I followed closely behind, pretending to check my phone, keeping an eye on her movements. The sun was warm, the sky a brilliant blue, and the gentle breeze carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine from Mrs. Peterson's garden to houses down. But then I saw her, Karen. She was leaning against her cherry-red SUV, arms crossed, her expression as sharp as a knife. As soon as our eyes met, I felt a chill run down my spine. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. Instead, her eyes narrowed, and a smirk played at the corners of her mouth, an expression I had come to recognize as a prelude to confrontation. "Good morning, Layla," Karen called out, her voice deceptively sweet but laced with something colder beneath the surface. Layla waved politely, smiling, unaware of the tension brewing. I slowed my pace, trying to gauge Karen's mood. Karen stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "I couldn't help but notice," she said, pointing at Layla's wheelchair, "that you've been occupying the sidewalk in a rather inconvenient manner." Her eyes flicked to me, searching for a reaction. "You know the rules?" "Of course. Sidewalks are for everyone." I felt my chest tighten. "We're careful," I said evenly. "Layla always stays close to the edge, making sure she doesn't block anyone." Karen's smirk widened, a dangerous glint appearing in her eyes. "Careful isn't good enough," she said softly, almost teasingly. "Sometimes, rules are meant to be enforced in ways people don't expect." There was an unspoken threat in her tone, one that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what she meant, but I knew instinctively that she was no longer content with simply making snide remarks or sending passive-aggressive HOA notices. Something had shifted. Her fixation on Layla had grown into something dark and personal. Layla, unaware of the tension, asked brightly, "Are you going to the park today, Mrs. Whitmore?" She smiled innocently, her eyes wide and trusting. Karen's expression changed, momentarily, almost as if surprised by Layla's cheerfulness, but the softness didn't last. She tilted her head slightly, and her gaze hardened. "I'll be watching," she said simply, and without another word. She turned sharply and walked back toward her house. The sound of her heels faded, but the unease she left behind lingered like a heavy fog. I looked down at Layla, who continued wheeling herself along the sidewalk, humming a tune I didn't recognize. My heart was pounding, Something was coming. Didn't know exactly what, but I knew that Karen's behavior had escalated beyond petty complaints. There was a darkness there, a willingness to cross lines that no neighbor should ever cross. And for the first time, I realized that my daughter's safety might be at risk. I called her back to the porch. "Layla," I said firmly, my voice shaking slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. "Wait here. We need to be careful around Karen. She's been acting differently lately." Layla tilted her head, curiosity mixing with concern. "What do you mean, Mommy?" I forced a smile, trying to sound reassuring. "Just remember to stay on the path. Be careful. And if anyone makes you feel unsafe, come straight to me." "Okay," she nodded, though a flicker of worry crossed her face. I watched as she adjusted her backpack and looked back toward the street. I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm of the morning was a fragile illusion, one that could shatter in an instant. As I turned back toward the house, I noticed Karen's window curtains twitch. I knew she was watching, always watching. And for the first time, I felt the unmistakable weight of impending danger. Something was coming, something I couldn't yet predict, and I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach, that it would change our lives forever. The calm had ended. The storm was approaching, and there was no escaping it. The afternoon air hung heavy with warmth, the kind that makes the world feel lazy and still. Layla had asked if she could roll down to the small park at the corner of the street, just a few blocks away. I hesitated, glancing at the sky and the quiet neighborhood, but decided she could go if I followed closely. She loved the swings, the small sandbox, and the laughter of other children, and I didn't want her to feel trapped by fear. We started down the familiar sidewalk, Layla wheeling herself carefully, humming a song that sounded happier than I felt. I walked beside her, scanning the street for any signs of Karen. My stomach twisted each time I imagined her lurking behind a bush, peering from her window, or even just waiting in her driveway, arms crossed, ready to pounce. And then I saw her. Karen had parked her car near the park entrance, her dark sunglasses masking her expression. Even from a distance, I could sense the intensity in her posture. She wasn't just observing casually, she was waiting, watching, calculating. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke across my back. "Layla," I whispered, lowering my voice, "stay close to me." "Okay." She nodded, though her smile betrayed no hint of fear. Children, I thought, often sense danger less than adults. They trust too easily. Karen, on the other hand, had no such innocence. As we drew closer, Karen stepped off the curb, blocking our path. She stood there, arms folded, lips pressed into a tight line. The air seemed to thicken with tension. The other parents with children noticed her and quickly turned their gaze away, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of her path. "Going to the park? Are we?" Karen said, her voice deceptively light, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I thought I'd remind you that this area isn't entirely for children like you." I froze, unsure how to respond. "Karen, she's just going to the park." She hasn't. What?" Karen interrupted sharply, cutting me off. "She hasn't followed my rules to the letter. She hasn't stayed exactly where I say. She hasn't. Well, she hasn't listened to me, and that's a problem." My heart sank. I realized then that reason would not sway her. Karen was beyond simple neighborly disputes. Her obsession with Layla had become personal, dangerous, even. I took a step forward, ready to shield my daughter, but Karen's eyes flicked to me, narrowing in a silent warning. "I think a lesson is in order," she said softly, almost casually, yet her tone made my blood run cold. Before I could react, she moved. Quick, aggressive, her hand shot out, grabbing Layla's wheelchair from behind. The momentum nearly toppled Layla, and I lunged forward, grabbing the side of the chair to stabilize her. "Karen, let go," I shouted, panic surging through me. But Karen's grip didn't loosen. Her face was twisted with a mixture of anger and perverse satisfaction. She yanked sharply, trying to push Layla backward. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Neighbors gasped, some screaming in shock, others frozen as if afraid to intervene. "Mommy," Layla cried, her small hands gripping the armrests tightly as Karen tried to shove her. The wheelchair tipped, slightly, the front wheels lifting off the ground, and I felt the sharp, gut-wrenching fear of losing control. I grabbed Karen's wrist, pulling with all my strength. "Stop it, you're hurting her." But she only laughed, a cold, cruel sound that made my blood run ice. "She needs to learn." Then, it happened, a sudden, forceful shove, stronger than I could resist. Layla's wheelchair lurched backward, uncontrollably. I stumbled, grasping at her, but Karen was stronger than I anticipated. The edge of the sidewalk gave way, and with a sickening thud, Layla tipped over, rolling down the small incline toward a ditch at the side of the park. Time froze. I screamed, rushing down the slope, my heart hammering in my chest. Layla's wheelchair had come to a stop at the bottom of the shallow ditch. Partially tilted, her small body slumped to one side. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of shock and fear. Her hands were scraped, and a trickle of blood ran from a small cut on her forehead. She was crying, her voice trembling, calling out for me. "Mommy, Mommy, it hurts." I threw myself beside her, checking her over, my hands shaking as I made sure she was breathing, conscious, and as uninjured as possible. Panic clawed at my chest, threatening to choke me. How could anyone be so cruel, so violent, toward a child? And worse, how could it happen right in front of everyone and not be stopped immediately? The neighbors who had witnessed the scene were now coming out of their stupor. Some were shouting at Karen, demanding she step back. Others ran to help us, calling 911. Karen, for a moment, seemed startled by the reaction, her composure faltering, but just for a moment. I didn't do anything, she snapped, her voice sharp, defensive, trying to regain control of the situation. She felt totally her fault, you'll see. Her denial only fueled the rising anger of the crowd. One brave neighbor stepped forward, pointing at her accusingly. "You pushed her?" Everyone saw it. Karen's lips tightened, her face pale with fury. She didn't speak, just stared at Layla in the ditch, then at me, as if calculating her next move. I held my daughter close, cradling her gently, whispering words of comfort, trying to calm her fear, while simultaneously trying to suppress my own rage. The distant wail of sirens grew louder. Someone had called 911, and soon, police and paramedics would arrive. But at that moment, in the heat of the confrontation, all I could focus on was my daughter's safety. I inspected her scrapes and bruises, pressing gently on her arm to ensure nothing was broken. She flinched at every movement, and I knew this incident would leave more than just physical marks. It would leave a deep emotional scar as well. Karen, meanwhile, backed away slightly, realizing that the situation had escalated beyond her control. Her eyes darted between the growing crowd and the approaching authorities, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hesitation in her steely demeanor. But I knew better than to underestimate her. She was dangerous, and this was far from over. As I lifted Layla from the ditch, supporting her fragile body against mine, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. My daughter looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, clutching my arms tightly. "Why would she do that, Mommy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know, baby," I said, my own voice breaking, "but I promise you, we'll make sure she can never hurt you again." And in that moment, I knew that our lives had changed forever. Karen's cruelty had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The calm of our neighborhood had been shattered, replaced with fear, anger, and the urgent need for justice. The wail of the approaching sirens seemed impossibly loud, cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen over our once quiet street. Neighbors were clustering in small groups, whispering frantically, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Some were trying to help, others were calling friends and family, while a few simply stared in disbelief. The shock of what had just occurred, what Karen had just done, hung heavily in the air, almost tangible, like smoke that refused to dissipate. I had Layla cradled in my arms, her small body pressed against mine. Her breathing was uneven, quick, gasps, interspersed with little sobs. She was trembling, not just from the fall, but from the fear that had gripped her from the moment Karen had shoved her. Blood streaked lightly down her forehead from the scrape she'd gotten when the wheelchair had tipped in the ditch. Her tiny hands clutched my shirt as though holding on for her very life. "Mommy, it hurts. It really hurts," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. I pressed a hand gently to her arm, trying to soothe her. "I know, baby, I know. We're going to get you help right now," I said, my voice shaking, barely able to contain my own terror and rage. My mind raced as I tried to think of every worst-case scenario: broken bones, head injuries, the shock of trauma. I knew I had to stay calm, for her, but the fire of anger toward Karen burned so fiercely in me that it was almost blinding. The first to reach us were two young neighbors, Jessica and Mark, who had been playing nearby. They knelt beside us, their faces pale, hands reaching instinctively to steady Layla. "Call 911, Jessica shouted, her voice shaking. "Hurry, someone, please." I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and dialed, between my sobs and the urgency in my voice. I barely managed to explain what had happened: my daughter, the fall, Karen's shove, the location. The operator was calm, professional, but even she seemed to register the gravity of the situation. "Emergency services are on their way," she said. "Please stay with your daughter and keep her still until help arrives." As I ended the call, I noticed Karen standing a few feet away, her face a pale mask. For a brief moment, it looked as if she might approach, perhaps to feign concern, perhaps to create confusion. But the intensity of the gathering crowd gave her pause. Neighbors were glaring at her, some shouting accusations, some stepping closer to form a barrier between her and us. "You pushed her? You saw what you did?" a man shouted from across the street. Another neighbor grabbed his phone and began filming, documenting Karen's actions, her denial, and the terrified state of my daughter. Karen's composure wavered, her lips pressed tightly together, eyes flicking nervously toward the cameras and the growing crowd. Within minutes, the flashing lights of the ambulance and police cars filled the street. The paramedics rushed toward us, assessing Layla immediately. They worked quickly, asking her questions, checking her limbs, applying antiseptic to the scrape on her forehead, and carefully helping her out of the wheelchair. My daughter flinched at every movement, but the paramedics spoke gently, calming her fears as best they could. I followed closely, holding her hand, murmuring reassuring words, doing everything I could to keep her calm. One of the paramedics wrapped her in a soft blanket to keep her warm, and another checked her vitals. My heart was pounding so hard that I was sure the paramedics could hear it. Does she have any severe pain in her arms or legs? The paramedic asked, his voice calm but insistent. She fell really fast. I don't know, I said, tears streaming down my face. I was right there. I tried to stop it. Karen, standing just a few feet away, had crossed her arms, her jaw tight. She looked like she was trying to maintain a mask of innocence, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Some neighbors yelled at her, calling her cruel, dangerous, and asking if she realized what she had done. She didn't respond, simply retreating toward her car as the paramedics continued their work. The police had arrived just as Layla was being loaded into the ambulance. I stayed by her side, clutching her hand, as one officer approached Karen. "Ma'am, we need your statement," he said firmly. "There are witnesses who saw what happened. Do you understand the severity of this?" Karen's response was almost absurdly casual. I didn't do anything, she said, voice brittle. She fell. "It's not my fault. I'm just enforcing the rules." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "We have witnesses, and this is considered assault. You're coming with us for questioning." Karen's face drained of color. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, a crack in the wall of arrogance and entitlement she had built. But even then, she tried to protest, to deflect responsibility, though it was clear to everyone present that the evidence and witnesses were overwhelming. As the ambulance drove away, taking my daughter to the hospital, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that she was in the hands of professionals who could treat her injuries and ensure she was safe. Dread for the emotional impact of the day with Layla. Trust the neighborhood again. Would she ever feel safe outside her home? At the hospital, the doctors ran scans, cleaned her wounds, and confirmed that, miraculously, Layla had no broken bones or serious internal injuries. Just bruises, scrapes, and the deep emotional trauma of betrayal and fear. I sat by her bed, holding her hand as she cried softly, whispering apologies that were entirely unnecessary, trying to make sense of what had happened. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I shouldn't have gone," she said, tears still streaking her cheeks. I held her close, shaking my head. "No, baby, you did nothing wrong. She's the one who hurt you, and she will face the consequences. I promise you that." Meanwhile, word of the incident had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People were calling each other, sharing videos and testimonies. Some families came to the hospital, offering support, bringing blankets and food. The community, previously fractured by petty HOA disputes, was now united in outrage. Karen's reputation was crumbling, her carefully maintained facade of authority shattered in an instant. But while the external chaos swirled, inside, my heart remained heavy. Layla had been violated in a way no child should ever experience. Her trust, her innocence, and her sense of safety had been violated by someone who was supposed to enforce rules, not harm a child. I vowed to myself, with every ounce of determination in my body, that we would not let Karen get away with this. We would fight, not just for justice, but for Layla's peace of mind. As night fell and the hospital lights glowed softly through the window, I sat by Layla's side, holding her hand tightly. The chaos of the day had passed, but the fight for justice was only beginning. And I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same, not for our family, not for our neighborhood, and certainly not for Karen. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of legal appointments, police statements, and emotional recovery. Layla remained under my constant care, her body healing from bruises and scrapes, but her spirit was still fragile. She had been confronted with fear in its rawest form, an adult abusing power against a child, and, while her physical wounds were minor, the emotional impact ran far deeper. The first step toward justice began the morning after the assault, when I returned to the scene with photos, videos, and witness statements. I needed the evidence to be undeniable. Neighbors who had seen the entire confrontation stepped forward one by one, recounting in detail Karen's aggression, her shove, and the look of cruel satisfaction on her face as my daughter tumbled into the ditch. Their voices were steady and resolute, fueled by outrage and a desire to protect the neighborhood from further harm. The police were thorough, taking written and recorded statements, collecting all evidence. They asked for every possible detail, times, positions, distances, and even descriptions of Karen's demeanor. For the first time, I felt a small sense of empowerment. Though nothing could undo what had happened to Layla, the truth was being recorded, solid and undeniable. and Karen's power was finally beginning to crack under the weight of accountability. Meanwhile, at home, Layla struggled to return to her normal routine. The first time we attempted to walk down the street, she hesitated at the edge of the sidewalk, her hands gripping the wheelchair tightly, her gaze darting nervously toward each house. "Mommy, what if she's still watching?" she whispered, a tremor in her voice. I knelt beside her, holding her face gently. "Layla, listen to me," I said softly, but firmly. "You are safe. I am here, and so are all the people who love you. She can't hurt you anymore, not while we are together." It took time, but gradually, with patience, reassurance, and small steps, she began to regain confidence. We practiced going to the park again, at first just sitting on the grass, then rolling slowly along the sidewalk, all the while surrounded by supportive neighbors who cheered her progress and offered encouragement. Every small smile regained, each fear confronted was a testament to her courage. Legally, the consequences for Karen began to unfold with alarming swiftness. The police charged her with assault and child endangerment, citing multiple witness statements and the video evidence captured by concerned neighbors. The HOA, which had previously protected her in minor disputes, could no longer shield her. The board members were faced with public scrutiny, as residents demanded accountability for the toxicity she had allowed to fester. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was tense. Karen sat rigidly, attempting to maintain her composure, but the judge and jury were clearly skeptical of her claims. Witnesses, including myself, the neighbors, and even the paramedics who had treated Layla, presented testimony detailing her actions and the immediate harm caused to my daughter. Photos of the scrape on Layla's forehead, the tipped wheelchair in the ditch, and the small bruise forming on her arm were displayed as evidence. Layla sat beside me during the proceedings, her small hand in mine, and I could see the strength in her eyes. She had endured terror, yet she remained brave, participating when asked to recount the events in a controlled, supportive environment. Her courage made the courtroom sit in silence. No one could doubt the trauma inflicted by Karen, and no one could doubt the child's resilience. In the end, Karen faced significant consequences. She was fined, removed from the HOA board, and ordered to undergo anger management and counseling. More importantly, the assault charges remained on her record, a permanent reminder that abuse, especially toward children, would not be tolerated. And the neighborhood felt a collective sense of relief. Justice had been served, not merely in punishment, but in acknowledgement of the wrongs inflicted upon an innocent child. For my family, the journey toward normalcy continued slowly. We established new routines, reinforcing safety measures while encouraging Layla to reclaim her sense of independence. Therapy sessions helped her process the fear and confusion, giving her tools to articulate emotions and confront lingering anxiety. Every day, I watched her grow stronger, more confident, and more willing to trust in the kindness of the world once again. The community rallied around us. Neighborhood watch programs were strengthened, lines of communication were improved, and parents spoke openly about the need to protect children from harassment. Karen's actions became a cautionary tale, a stark warning of what happens when authority is abused. But more than fear, it instilled vigilance, empathy, and the importance of standing up for the vulnerable. That I often reflect on that day, the moment when Karen pushed my daughter into the ditch, and the flood of emotions that followed. There was fear, yes, but also a fierce determination to protect, to fight, and to teach my daughter that strength doesn't always come from size or power, but from courage, love, and the support of a community. Now, as I watch Layla roll through, her neighbor with a smile, waving at neighbors who cheer her on, I am reminded that darkness cannot last when confronted with resilience. She learned that even in moments of terror, bravery and truth have the power to prevail. And I learned, as a parent, that standing up against injustice, no matter how intimidating, is not just necessary, it is essential. The storm had passed, leaving scars, lessons, and a renewed sense of safety and vigilance. Karen had lost her authority, her credibility, and her ability to harm. But our family had gained something far more enduring, a bond forged in adversity, a